The receptionist tried to humiliate Karoline Leavitt at check-in, but by sunrise, she was the one out the door. Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the black SUV with purpose, her heels clicking confidently against the pavement outside the Harborfront Grand in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The air had that early spring bite to it, and the wind off the water tugged at the hem of her coat. She adjusted her tote over her shoulder and glanced at the glass doors ahead. A quick glance at her watch. She was right on time. Inside, the hotel lobby was calm, quiet, just how she liked it. Warm lighting bounced off polished tile floors. There was a crackling fireplace off to the left, a few guests sipping coffee nearby, their weekend bags set at their feet. Karoline approached the front desk with a polite smile. Behind the counter stood a young woman, maybe mid-20s, auburn pixie cut, a nose ring, chipped black polish on her nails. She looked up, made eye contact, and just for a second, something flickered in her expression. Not recognition, not quite. Then the smirk came. "Hi. Checking in," she said flatly, not even bothering to pull up the reservation system. "Yes. Karoline Leavitt." "Reservation should be under that name," Karoline replied, still smiling, setting her ID and credit card gently on the counter. The receptionist picked up the ID slowly, her eyes flicked to the name, then up again. "Oh, you're that Karoline Leavitt." It wasn't said loudly, but it wasn't under her breath either. A few heads turned. Karoline's smile stayed in place. "Is there an issue?" The receptionist's fingers tapped lazily on the keyboard. "Just didn't expect someone like you to stay here, that's all." She chuckled to herself, as if she'd made a joke only she could hear. Karoline said nothing. "Not yet." She glanced behind her. A middle-aged couple in fleece jackets stood waiting behind her in line. The man looked annoyed. The woman raised her eyebrows slightly, as if to say, "Did she just say that?" The receptionist clicked around on her screen, slower than necessary, then sighed dramatically. Looks like your room isn't ready yet." Karoline checked her watch again. "It's 4:05. Your policy says check-in is at 3. "Yeah, sometimes housekeeping's just behind," she replied, still not making eye contact. "Maybe grab a coffee or something. I'll text you when it's ready." Karoline took a slow breath. "Could you double-check that, please? I'm here for an event this evening, and I really do need to get settled." There was a pause, and for a moment, it looked like the receptionist might actually be reconsidering. But then the smirk returned. "I'll check again," she said, overpronouncing it like a kindergarten teacher. The couple behind Karoline exchanged glances. Another guest, seated in the corner near the fireplace, discreetly lifted their phone and angled it forward. Not obvious, but noticeable if you were paying attention. "I'm sure you understand," the receptionist said. "We just have certain standards here. Can't always accommodate everyone right away." Karoline finally looked her in the eye, not angry, not even stern, just measured. "I'm a guest. I've booked, confirmed, and arrived on time. That should be all that matters." Silence followed. A few more people had entered the lobby and were starting to pick up the energy. The receptionist's expression wavered, not quite embarrassed, but definitely losing control of the situation. Still, she didn't apologize. Karoline stepped aside, calm but firm. "Let me know when the room's ready. I'll be right over there." She walked toward the leather chairs near the window and pulled out her phone. She didn't make a call, didn't go live, just opened a weather app and started scrolling. Eyes focused, body still. The message was clear. She wasn't rattled. She just wanted to be treated like any other guest. But something in the air had shifted, and more than one person had started paying closer attention. A low murmur floated through the lobby. Not loud, not disruptive, just enough that you could tell people were talking and watching. The couple who'd been behind Karoline in line moved off to the side, whispering. "She's not even trying to hide it," the woman muttered, arms crossed, her voice tight with secondhand embarrassment. "You saw her tone, right? Like she was trying to start something." The man just shook his head, eyes drifting back to the front desk. "Unprofessional. Doesn't matter who the guest is." Across the room, the young woman by the fireplace, the one who'd subtly recorded part of the interaction, was now sitting with her friend. Her phone rested face down in her lap, but her thumb hovered near the screen. They were whispering too, barely audible. "Should I post it?" she asked. Her friend hesitated. "I mean, it's not like she shouted anything, but still. You could feel it." "I know. It just didn't sit right. It's like she wanted to humiliate her." The two paused as the receptionist suddenly called up the next guest in line, smiling sweetly, her tone suddenly syrupy and cheerful. "Welcome to the Harborfront Grand. Checking in?" she said with fake perkiness, completely flipping her demeanor for the couple behind Karoline. The woman at the counter glanced over at Karoline, who was still seated calmly by the window, tapping out something on her phone. She wasn't showing emotion. That, in a strange way, made it worse. "She's acting like nothing happened," the young woman said. "But it's all on video. Should I just upload it anonymously?" Her friend nodded. "If you feel like it needs to be seen, yeah. It's not about sides. It's about how you treat people." Back at the front desk, the receptionist, name tag reading Rowan Bixby, finished checking in the couple, still beaming with customer service energy. But as they turned to leave, her smile faded the second she looked at Karoline again. She leaned slightly over the counter and said, loud enough for Karoline to hear, "Some folks really think the world owes them a gold medal just for showing up." Karoline didn't flinch. She just looked over, met her eyes briefly, then went back to her phone. Rowan rolled her eyes dramatically and ducked into the back office. That was the moment the young woman by the fireplace pressed upload. The video, 23 seconds long, showed Rowan's first snarky comment, the intentional delay, and the final remark as she walked off screen. She uploaded it under a burner account with the caption, "This happened today at the Harborfront Grand. Professionalism matters." Within 20 minutes, it had a few dozen views. Nothing wild, but someone retweeted it with the comment, "I don't care who the guest is, this is just wrong." That's when it started picking up. In the lobby, Karoline still hadn't moved from her seat. She texted a colleague to let them know she might be running late, but didn't mention why. She wasn't angry, not outwardly. She just wasn't playing into the script Rowan had clearly expected. The receptionist reemerged a few minutes later, her phone in hand, scrolling rapidly. She looked annoyed, then confused, then nervous. She disappeared again behind the office door. Meanwhile, the lobby buzzed with low conversation. The man from earlier sat beside Karoline after getting his room key. "You handled that well," he said quietly, not looking directly at her. Karoline gave a polite nod, not needing to say anything more. Outside, the sky was starting to shift to that late afternoon gold. Inside, something very different was beginning to simmer. The first few shares had started making the rounds, and by evening, the video would be in front of thousands. But Rowan had no idea just how fast things were moving behind the screen. By 8:45 that evening, the video had already hit 10,000 views. It was no longer just bouncing around anonymous corners of social media. It had landed in group chats, local forums, and eventually on the page of a regional reporter who added, "Not the first time I've heard about this hotel having issues." From there, it spread like wildfire. Still, Karoline hadn't said a word about it publicly. She checked into her room finally around 5:40 p.m. A different front desk clerk, flustered and apologetic, handed her the key while avoiding eye contact. No mention of what happened earlier, no explanation, just a rushed, "Enjoy your stay, ma'am," and a flash of guilt behind the smile. Karoline nodded, thanked him, and went straight to her room. No rants online, no Instagram posts. She called her husband, unpacked her dress for the speaking event, and moved on with her evening. Meanwhile, Rowan was still working her shift. She had no clue that she'd been filmed, or that the clip had taken on a life of its own. But she could feel something. The energy was off. The whispers among coworkers had a sharp edge now, and her manager, Calvin Rohr, had poked his head out of the office more than once with a confused frown. Rowan brushed it off. She assumed someone had complained, maybe that couple, or one of the older women reading a magazine by the fireplace. But she didn't care. She was proud of how she handled herself. People like Karoline, in her eyes, deserved to be brought down a peg. At 10:03 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from her friend Melanie. "Girl, are you going viral?" Rowan squinted at her screen. "What?" Then Melanie sent the link. The blood drained from Rowan's face as she clicked the video. There she was, her voice, her smirk, her words, all on full display. No editing, no captions, just raw footage of her behaving in a way she couldn't talk her way out of. She looked around. Nobody had said anything yet, but someone had seen this, she could feel it. She immediately texted Melanie. "Did you post this?" "No," Melanie replied. "Looks like a burner account, but it's out there. People are heated." Heated was putting it lightly. By midnight, the video had reached a national audience. Influencers reposted it. News sites picked it up with headlines like, "Hotel employee confronts political figure during check-in. Guest remains silent." But here's the twist that caught everyone off guard. Most of the reactions weren't political. Sure, a few people on both sides tried to make it about ideology, but the overwhelming majority? They were just shocked at the disrespect. It didn't matter who the guest was. It was about how she was treated. She handled it better than I ever could have, one comment read. Politics aside, this is customer service 101. Yikes, said another. Imagine being judged the second you walk up to the counter. That's just gross. Even Karoline's critics had to admit she hadn't thrown a fit. She hadn't tried to retaliate. She'd been composed, polite, even patient. By sunrise, the video had over 300,000 views. Rowan hadn't slept. She deleted her Instagram, locked her Twitter, but it was too late. Her name was out. Someone in the comments had recognized her from a LinkedIn profile and posted it. The phone at the hotel front desk rang constantly that morning. Guests, reporters, even strangers calling to ask if Rowan still worked there. Calvin, the manager, was bombarded. He stepped into the office, closed the door, and called corporate. Karoline, meanwhile, checked out early, quietly. She didn't need to be there for the chaos. By 9 a.m., a local news crew was parked outside. The hotel released a short statement that read, "We are aware of the incident involving a staff member and a guest. This does not reflect the standards or values of our hotel. The individual is no longer employed with us." But Rowan hadn't even made it to her shift when she found out. Her name was already trending, and not in the way she'd ever wanted. Calvin Rohr had been in hotel management for 17 years, and not once had he seen a mess like this blow up overnight. Usually, when there was drama, it was over billing errors, noisy guests, or someone sneaking in a pet. But this was national news now. He stared at his computer, the video playing silently on loop, Rowan's smirk, her sarcasm, her body language, all frozen on his screen, dissected by thousands of people. His inbox was a war zone. PR reps from corporate had already sent a damage control template, and his district manager was scheduled to call in 20 minutes. He rubbed his temples. Rowan hadn't shown up for her shift that morning. Not that he expected her to. Still, protocol was protocol. He called her cell. Straight to voicemail. He didn't bother leaving a message. Meanwhile, downstairs, the lobby had an odd tension to it. Guests walked in quietly, glanced around as if expecting something dramatic to happen again. A couple of them even took pictures of the front desk, hoping to catch the manager or maybe recognize the woman from the video. The staff kept their heads down. No one talked about it, but everyone was thinking the same thing. This had gone way beyond local. By 10:15 a.m., Rowan walked through the employee entrance, hoodie pulled low, sunglasses on inside, hair tucked back. She looked like someone trying not to be recognized, which, ironically, made her more noticeable. Calvin met her just past the service hallway. "Office." "Now," he said, his voice clipped. Rowan didn't say a word. She followed him in, closed the door behind her, and stood with her arms crossed, already bracing for a fight. Calvin didn't bother easing into it. "You knew this was wrong. Even if you disagreed with her, this was about how you represented this hotel, and you embarrassed us." Rowan's voice cracked with frustration. "She's dangerous. People like her." "Stop," he said sharply. "This isn't about your opinion. This is about your job, and your job was to check in a guest, treat them with respect, and keep it moving. You made it personal." Rowan scoffed. "So that's it? You're just going to fire me because some video made people uncomfortable?" Calvin paused. His voice softened just a bit. "No, I'm letting you go because you were unprofessional, on camera, in uniform, while representing this brand. Politics has nothing to do with it. You could have done that to anyone, and we'd be sitting here having the same conversation." Rowan clenched her jaw, but deep down, she knew she couldn't argue with that. She'd always been a little too loose with sarcasm, too eager to throw shade, but it had never cost her anything, until now. "You'll be paid through the end of the week," Calvin added. "We'll be mailing out your final paperwork." She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. She'd imagined herself arguing, demanding to stay, maybe walking out with her head held high. But now, the reality of it settled in. Not just the job, but the internet knowing her face, her name, her moment of pettiness forever sealed in pixels. She left through the side door, avoiding the lobby. Outside, her phone buzzed again. A message from an old classmate she hadn't spoken to in years. "Saw the video. Damn. Hope you're okay." She didn't reply. Back inside, Calvin sat in his office, staring at the now muted news coverage playing on his monitor. The clip had already reached the morning shows. One anchor commented, "The real issue here isn't who the guest was, It's the reminder that we've lost the art of basic decency. That line stuck with him. Upstairs, housekeeping reset room 414. The room Karoline had occupied just hours ago. No damage, nothing left behind. Just a folded brochure from the event she'd spoken at and a handwritten thank you note left on the pillow, addressed to the cleaning staff. But outside that quiet room, the conversation was only getting louder. The firestorm didn't die down. It morphed. By the next afternoon, national commentators were talking about the Harborfront Grand incident like it was a social mirror, a moment that forced people to look hard at how conviction could tip into cruelty. The headlines didn't focus on Karoline's politics. Instead, they zeroed in on professionalism, the boundaries between personal opinion and workplace behavior, and the price of a public mistake. Karoline still hadn't made any big statement. Just a single, composed tweet. I checked in quietly like anyone else. What happened speaks for itself. I wish her well. Short. Measured. Not a jab, not a rallying cry. Just a sentence that made people pause. The replies flooded in. Some praised her grace. Others said it was PR strategy. But many agreed on one thing. The reaction wasn't about politics anymore. It was about the everyday ways people treat each other when they think no one's watching. News outlets began running think pieces. Morning radio callers weighed in. Twitter turned into a battleground of empathy and defiance. One person wrote, "If you're in customer service, your job is to serve, not judge." Another shot back, "Why should someone have to serve a person who promotes what they hate?" The hotel's Yelp page exploded with reviews from people who'd never been there. Some praised Karoline. Others defended Rowan. The internet did what it always does. It made it everyone's business. Meanwhile, Rowan was stuck between shock and defiance. One part of her wanted to apologize. Another part still believed she was right. But the job was gone, and now so were her profiles. She'd shut down everything except a locked Facebook account, which was mostly silent except for a long post from her cousin defending her. "Rowan's not a bad person," it read. "She's passionate. She's just emotional. She stands up for what she believes. Maybe this went too far, but let's not act like she's evil." That post was shared, screenshotted, quoted. Some used it to defend her. Others pointed out that being emotional didn't excuse public humiliation. The conversation had cracked wide open. In a segment on WBZ in Boston, a legal analyst broke it down. Private employers have every right to terminate someone if their conduct reflects poorly on the business. The fact that this happened on video in uniform while on the clock, that's textbook misconduct. Whether you agree with her or not doesn't change the rules. Another host chimed in. "It's wild to me that people are arguing over whether she deserved it. You humiliate someone at work. That's not activism. That's bad judgment." At a coffee shop in downtown Portsmouth, two college students debated it over iced lattes. "I get that she had feelings about Karoline, I do," one said. "But what did she think was going to happen? That she'd get a pat on the back?" The other shrugged. "Honestly, I think she just snapped, like it was a power play. A moment of I'm in control here, and it backfired." Not everyone saw it that way. At a bookstore up the street, an older woman with a silver braid and wire-rimmed glasses was organizing a small discussion group for women who wanted to talk about the incident. The flyer read, "Where do beliefs belong? A conversation about values and professionalism." People were shaken, not just because of what happened, but because it could have been them. Anyone with a strong opinion. Anyone with a temper. But in all the noise, one question refused to fade. How far is too far when your personal beliefs clash with your role in public? By the end of the week, Rowan Bixby's life had completely changed. Her face had been replayed across every major news outlet. She couldn't open her email without seeing subject lines from reporters asking for her side. A few offered money for interviews. Most just wanted a quote to keep the story alive. But she wasn't ready to speak. The truth was, she didn't know what to say. She'd gone from quiet confidence to full-blown panic. Each time she saw a new video stitched with commentary, it chipped away at her defensiveness. The smirk that once made her feel powerful now looked juvenile. The sarcasm cruel. She didn't need strangers to tell her. She was already ashamed. Rowan had always prided herself on being unapologetically herself. In college, she'd led rallies, protested policies, and never backed down from a debate. But working behind a hotel counter wasn't a protest. It was a paycheck, and now she didn't have that either. She'd applied for 3 jobs already. No callbacks. When one manager asked if she had any public-facing incidents they should be aware of, her stomach dropped. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Nothing significant," she said. He looked her up and down, didn't press further, but she never heard from them again. Back in her apartment, the blinds stayed drawn. She wasn't going out. Every time she did, she felt eyes on her, real or imagined. A few people had recognized her at the grocery store. One woman stared, another whispered to her husband. Only one person approached her directly. "You that girl from the hotel?" The man asked, mid-30s, holding a bag of oranges. She froze. "Yeah." He didn't scold her, didn't yell. He just shook his head. "You really thought that was a good idea?" She didn't answer. "You could have just given her the key." Then he walked off. No drama, no threat, just disappointment. That night, she sat in bed scrolling through comments again, even though she swore she'd stop. Among the chaos, one post stood out. Not flashy, not aggressive, just simple. "We all have opinions, but it's what you do when you're on the clock that shows your character." She read it 3 times, saved it, closed the app. Meanwhile, Karoline was back on the road. Her team had scheduled 2 new appearances, one in Pennsylvania, the other in Vermont. At both stops, people mentioned what had happened in Portsmouth. Not in a tell-us-more way, but in quiet conversations before or after her speech. It was wrong what that girl did. A woman in her 60s told Karoline gently outside a town hall event. "You didn't deserve that." Nobody does. Karoline always thanked them, kept it brief. She didn't want to turn it into a political tool. Privately, though, she'd been thinking about it nonstop. Not because it hurt her, she was used to criticism, but because it felt like a mirror reflecting something darker. She told a colleague during a car ride, "It wasn't about me. Not really. It was about someone deciding I didn't deserve basic respect. And that scares me. Not for me, but for anyone who walks into a place expecting to be treated fairly and instead gets mocked because of who they are or what they believe." Her team didn't need to spin that. It was real. It resonated. Elsewhere, people were having the same conversation. Not on TV, not in comment sections, but in homes, classrooms, coffee shops. Not everyone agreed on where the line should be, but almost everyone agreed there has to be a line. People started thinking about their own behavior. The barista they snapped at, the customer they rolled their eyes at, the job interview where they thought about making a smart remark and didn't, because one moment, one smirk, one sentence too far could now be captured and replayed forever. But even as the storm passed, one final thought began to settle. It's not about whether we're right. It's about how we treat people when no one's clapping. By the following week, the story had mostly cooled off, at least in the media cycle. The video wasn't being shared every 5 minutes anymore. New scandals had taken over. New debates. New headlines. But for the people directly involved, the fallout lingered in quieter, deeper ways. Rowan sat across from her mother at a tiny kitchen table in Dover, picking at a half-eaten plate of scrambled eggs. She hadn't said much in the last hour. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was weighted. Her mother finally broke it. "You used to say you wanted to make the world better," she said softly. "I believe you still do. But that wasn't the way." Rowan didn't argue. She just nodded once, almost imperceptibly. I thought if I stayed quiet, I'd feel like a coward. And if I spoke, I'd be a villain. I don't know where the middle is anymore." Her mother reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "The middle is where most of us live. It's not loud, but it's where people actually listen." Across the state, Karoline stood backstage at a charity dinner in Nashua. The lights outside the curtain were low and golden, the sound of clinking silverware and quiet laughter filtering in. Her assistant handed her a short stack of note cards. She didn't need them. She looked down at her hands, then up at the curtain. Before stepping out, she turned to her assistant. "You know what bothered me most about that moment?" "What?" She didn't see me. Just an image in her head, a caricature, not a person. The assistant nodded slowly. "That's how people stop talking to each other." Karoline didn't reply. She simply walked out onto the stage, greeted the crowd, and gave a speech that touched only briefly on the incident, just enough to acknowledge it, not enough to stir it back up. That was intentional. She didn't want to fuel division. What she wanted, and what she tried to model, was composure, dignity. The kind of presence that didn't require yelling to be heard. In the days that followed, there was no grand apology from Rowan, no exclusive interview, no redemption arc, just quiet reflection and the slow process of picking up the pieces. A week later, she applied for a receptionist role at a vet clinic outside of town. Smaller place. Slower pace. Different crowd. During the interview, the hiring manager, a middle-aged woman in denim and sneakers, looked her in the eye and said, "I'm familiar with what happened. I don't need the whole story. Just tell me. One thing, what did you learn?" Rowan hesitated. Then, for once, she didn't try to explain, didn't try to justify. She just said, "I forgot that people aren't the worst version of their headlines, and I let my pride get louder than my purpose." The woman considered that, then smiled faintly. "You'll start Monday." And just like that, Rowan got a second chance. Not because she earned forgiveness, but because she was willing to sit in the truth without trying to spin it. Meanwhile, people who saw the video weeks ago had already moved on, but something subtle stayed with them. An echo, a reminder that every single day we are faced with moments where we get to decide. Are we here to fight, or are we here to treat each other like people? This wasn't a story about a political figure or a hotel clerk. It wasn't about left versus right. It was about what happens when someone in a position of service forgets that service requires humility. It was about what happens when someone on the receiving end chooses grace over retaliation. And more than anything, it was about the quiet power of restraint. The idea that sometimes the most impactful thing you can do is simply not react the way the world expects you to. So, the next time you're standing behind a counter, or waiting in line, or facing someone you disagree with, remember this story. Not for the drama, but for the choice each person made. And ask yourself, what would you have done? If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more real, thought-provoking narratives that remind us who we are, and who we still have the chance to be.